We're excited to talk about decentralizing decentralization today, and Victoria is going to talk about funding and voting as well. She is an applied mathematician who's contributed in whole or in part to published works on topics such as why do Fibonacci numbers occur in pine cones, the effect of learning by teaching in a flipped classroom, and she's also written for projects about the Lambert function. She is a CRISPR genome modification author as well, and has been involved in the blockchain community since 2017. It's my great pleasure to introduce Victoria Lee.
All right. So yeah, decentralizing decentralization. And feel free to give feedback and discuss. That's my Twitter. And these slides are available on that website as well. First, a disclaimer. These ideas are not necessarily mine, but the result of collaboration with various individuals and organizations. I am just a teacher. So let's start with, what is decentralization? Well, lack of centralized whatever. In other words, no single point of failure. And the Oculus-Off white paper, which just recently came out, and I highly recommend reading, gives a great definition of some examples. So political decentralization, architectural decentralization, and logical decentralization. Political decentralization means no one controls it. Architectural decentralization, there is no infrastructural central point of failure. And logical decentralization, there is no one commonly agreed on state, and the system doesn't behave like a single computer. So ask yourself, are blockchains politically, architecturally, and/or logically decentralized? Well, they're politically decentralized. They're controlled by distributed consensus. Blockchains are architecturally decentralized. They're distributed. But they're not logically decentralized unless you're referring to a blockchain as meaning the blockchain including all its soft and hard forks. Decentralization tends to manifest as DAOs. Decentralized autonomous organizations. In other words, decentralized funding and decision-making. And the Oculus-Off white paper gives a formal definition. A DAO is an organization represented by rules encoded as a computer program that is transparent, controlled by shareholders, and not influenced by a central government. A DAO's financial transaction record and program rules are maintained on a blockchain. So in other words, it's governed by smart contracts. So can anyone think of an example of a DAO? What? Yeah. Yep, Mullet DAO, Ethereum.
Or the DAO that BISC is built to manage developing their software. It's built on Bitcoin with colored coins.
Oh, BISC. I didn't know they were a DAO. Cool. Well, I'm going to look at the blockchain that started it all, Bitcoin. And just a little bit of history, Bitcoin was started in 2009 when Satoshi Nakamoto published the Bitcoin white paper. But first, let's just be clear that open source and decentralized are not the same thing. What makes Bitcoin open source is anyone can view, pull request, and fork projects, and anyone can propose Bitcoin improvement proposals on the Bitcoin GitHub. But what makes Bitcoin decentralized is decisions are made by the collective. So in terms of the creation, mining, and validation of blocks, that's done by distributed consensus. In terms of the code that encodes the rules to run the blockchain, anyone can make soft forks and hard forks, so they can make whatever rules they want on a copy of the Bitcoin blockchain. And everyone decides for themselves what fork to use. As an example, in September 2010 was probably the first soft fork, and it made a 1 megabyte block size limit. A soft fork is a fork that's backwards compatible. So this is a soft fork because whether or not people upgraded to the new version, they were still able to mine blocks on both versions. And another example, in August 2017, was the Bitcoin Cash hard fork. Hard fork is not backwards compatible. So in this case, people weren't able to mine Bitcoin Cash blocks unless they upgraded to the Bitcoin Cash hard fork. So as you can see, you can make whatever rules you want, but you won't necessarily get any support. And on a philosophical note, there are some DAOs that can't be defined. This is the first line of the Dao De Jing. The Dao that is spoken is not the true Dao. The name that is named is not the true name. So as blockchain organizations have increased, so they have run into organization problems. Enter token engineering. One of the questions that token engineering seeks to answer is, how do we decide how we make decisions? Currently, we're using a system that's about 300 years old. It was created at a time when everything was done on paper, before computers and internet existed. So it might be time for an upgrade, much like the upgrade from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0. Web 1.0 was mostly about commercial usage, and Web 2.0 is all about the individual and networks, social media, startups. But Web 2.0 also has its problems, and we have a solution in Web 3, which is currently under development, and we're defining it as we go along. But currently it has something to do with peer-to-peer, zero-knowledge, encryption, free Libra open source software, post-quantum, etc. DAOs as well. And many voting solutions have arisen out of this. But before I talk about them, I want to talk about Gibbard's theorem, which was proven by Gibbard in this article. And it says that every deterministic voting scheme is either dictatorial, so there's one outcome, or there are two outcomes, or it's manipulable. And by deterministic voting scheme, Gibbard means a function that takes the strategies that the voters each chose as input and outputs an outcome, like an outcome of a game. And by manipulable, Gibbard means every voter has a preference of outcomes. And depending on how all the other voters voted, they can better achieve their preferred outcome by voting with a different strategy than the strategy that represents their true preference. I'll give an example of this, but first I want to talk about two-outcome voting. So we know that dictatorship is too centralized, and we don't want manipulability because then everyone's going to be trying to figure out how everyone else is voting, and depending on how everyone else is voting, you'll change your strategy, and then depending on your strategy, everyone else changes their strategy, and then you change your strategy, and it's just this unending cycle of manipulation, much like our current elections. So you might say, well, we could just make all votes have only two outcomes. But as proven in this article, a two-outcome vote doesn't exist, because you can always add a third outcome, none of the above, or all of the above. So it's clear that in order to achieve non-manipulability, we need to think outside of the definition of a deterministic voting scheme as defined by Gibbard. And there have been many great ideas. And I'm sure there will be many more. I'm sure that we're all familiar with one person, one vote, maybe rank voting. Another type of voting is approval voting, and it's actually been around for a while. And it's defined by the election science website as you can give one vote to each candidate that you approve of. And you can approve of as many candidates as you want. This is manipulable, and here's an example. Suppose there are 3 outcomes, your first choice, your second choice, and your last choice. And currently, they each have 1 vote. So what's your optimal strategy? Well, you want your first choice to win. So you would vote 1 for your first choice, 0 for your second choice, 0 for your third choice, or 1, 0, 0. But then suppose the current votes were 1, 4, 4. Then what's your optimal voting strategy? Feel free to shout out. Well, no matter how you vote, your first choice isn't going to win. So it's either your second choice or your third choice is going to win. So either way, you're going to have to vote something different. In this case, 1, 1, 0. And quadratic voting is where everyone gets an equal number of voice tokens. And when you put in n squared voice tokens towards a candidate, you put in n votes for that candidate. So for example, if you have 100 tokens, you can give 10 votes to one candidate, or 5 votes each to 4 candidates, or 1 vote each to 100 candidates, and so on. Is this manipulable? Yes. Futarchy, also known as signaling markets, tries to make a more non-deterministic voting scheme. So, as described in this article, it's vote on values, bet on beliefs. So now people are betting on which proposal will win, and they get paid depending on which proposal wins. And if you trade I pay you $1 if this proposal wins assets, then the price of these assets is going to tend towards the expected earnings from buying them, which is equal to the probability that that particular proposal wins. So the prices of the assets tell you which proposal is currently winning. And the vote on values part is using this method to decide on a way to measure welfare. And then the bet on beliefs part is now you're betting on the welfare that a particular proposal will create if it wins. So now you're trading assets that say, I pay you W dollars if this proposal wins, where W is however much welfare that proposal creates if it wins. And in this case, the price will tend towards the expected value of the welfare created by a proposal if that proposal wins. So looking at the prices tells you the merit of each proposal. What remains to be determined is when a proposal wins. In other words, when does everyone get paid? Which could be a bone of contention. There are, however, solutions such as resource allocation through merit signaling. Another idea is, well, just make the decision a continuous decision. In other words, we never arrive at a decision. Or rather, we're constantly arriving at a decision through continuous voting. So these ideas are voting schemes that are continuous, non-manipulable, and they don't require enforcement. In voting by contributing, you basically do whatever you want, but bear the consequences. So you create whatever projects you want and work on them, and you also support whatever projects you want. So you might ask, well, what if two projects conflict? And I'll answer this in ownership. Conviction voting is where the voters stake their tokens in support of the various projects in different percentages of conviction or support. Much like a water faucet that distributes water among different pots. And they're continuously adjusting how much they support each one by like increasing or decreasing from this pot and redistributing it and increasing it to that pot. And the question of what to do with these percentages is in progress as of like now. But again, an option would be merit signaling. All right, so all of these ideas are great in theory, but you can't know for sure until you test them. And at Disclosure Exchange, we're currently working on building that. But there have been many experiments. And what better experiment than real life? So quadratic voting was implemented for the Colorado House of Representatives Democratic Caucus of 2019, where every legislator got 100 tokens, and they used this to determine out of like over 100 proposals, which proposals to fund first. And it seems to have worked. One representative says there was a pretty clear signal on which items, which bills were the most important for the caucus to fund. We've got plutocracy being implemented by Aragon. So Aragon has these voting periods during which the holders of Aragon's token stake their tokens towards the various proposals that are up for a vote. And at the end of the voting period, the majority vote wins. And this resulted in an interesting phenomenon with Aragon Governance Proposal 42, in which, as you can see, these are all the votes over time. And then at the very last, and this was also, by the way, a very contentious vote that was tied between the supporters and the opposers. And at the very last minute, a whale, like a very rich person, comes in and completely decides the vote. So that's plutocracy, governance by the wealthy. Signaling markets have been implemented. There's the famous signaling market Augur, which at one point in time was taking bets on things like, will Donald Trump get assassinated or die in 2018? Which would incentivize the people who bet on it to make it happen. But as you can see here, no one bet on it, and now it is expired. We also have MakerDAO, what they call continuous approval voting. It's actually more like continuous plutocracy because it's voting by the holders of Maker token, and they stake however many tokens they want towards the proposals they support, or how many of the tokens they hold. So naturally, and it's continuous because proposals are continuously being made, and whichever proposal happens to have the most votes at a given time is the one that's implemented at that time. So this will incentivize Maker holders to keep increasing the MakerDAO stability fee, which they have. Over the course of this year, they've increased the stability fee from about 0% to about 20% currently. Some people have been looking at the funding of decentralization through crypto economics. So the current state of inflation is unsustainable. It's perfectly possible to have an economy without inflation if the goods per dollar that you can buy is equal to 1 over the dollars per good that you can earn. On the left here is a graph of the goods per dollar. And as you can see, the purchasing power of the US dollar has greatly decreased since 1913. On the right is a graph of dollars per good that you can earn. And it varies depending on your average household income, whether you're in the top 1% or the various quintiles. And as you can see, about the lower 50% of the population's wages are not keeping up with inflation. Recently, there was also a proposal for inflation funding for Ethereum, Ethereum Improvement Proposal 2025, which would have created inflation as well as centralization through a centralized fund for Ethereum. And this proposal was met with, was highly criticized by the Ethereum community and has been canceled, as the proposer tweeted here. Well, so they say. So the goal, though, is sustainability. And what makes Bitcoin different from fiat and highly successful, according to this article, is its decentralized, trustless, and peer-to-peer, in other words, no middlemen, nature. In other words, transparency. And thanks to the work of various individuals and organizations, we are living in an increasingly transparent world. And then this article says that meritocracies maximize merit and nature maximizes efficiency. So how do we achieve both? And by merit, we don't mean we label each person as meritorious and not meritorious. By merit, we mean that at any given time, any given person has different merit in different areas. Okay, and we also have solutions for funding. So augmented token bonding curves, as far as I know, first appeared in the Bancor white paper. And it's was later popularized through the Giveth Medium articles. But it's clear to see that they came up with these independently. Like the way they explain it and approach it is just completely different. But as I'll discuss in ownership, it doesn't matter anyways. So augmented token bonding curves are basically a continuous, self-sustaining, fully backed native currency called a token. And the augmented token bonding curve is a function R of C, which has some shape, and it's increasing. And people buy tokens by depositing funds into a reserve. And they can redeem these tokens at any time by exchanging for funds in the reserve. And the cool thing about this is that the purchase price of tokens is completely determined by the current amount of funds in the reserve. So the purchase price is P of R equals DRDC. In other words, how many funds you pay the reserve divided by how many tokens the reserve pays you. The tokens are fully backed by the reserve, so the redeem price of a token is S of R equals R over C of R. And in a proof in this article, it was proven that R has to be less than C of R DRDC, or else the price of the tokens will be constant, which makes it useless as a store of value, which makes it not actually a currency. So to satisfy that, R equals AC to the K works for constants A and K greater than 1. Giveth, by the way, calls A 1 over V naught. And as it turns out, it's really hard to find another function that works, which is interesting because if you want to find out whether a currency is actually backed, you just have to figure out how many funds are in reserve at any time, and then just check that it matches that curve. And it works out because the value of the tokens increases as the funds invested in the tokens increases. So at Disclosure Exchange, we took this and created an investment model. So anyone can contribute at any time to a DAO, and they can contribute funds to the reserve fund by purchasing tokens, funds to the project fund via a transaction or service fee on the purchase of tokens, and directly work on projects. And contributors are rewarded respectively by tokens, which are tied to the value of a good or service produced by the DAO, rewarded by the development of said good or service, and paid by resource allocation. The transaction fee is determined by the market, specifically the part of the market that cares enough to contribute, through merit signaling. And tokens are a currency because they can be used as a store of value, so they can be redeemed for the underlying asset at any time, a medium of exchange, so exchanged for other tokens and currencies, and a unit of account, so purchasing goods and services. So what do we do with these funds? Well, resource allocation. Mechanism design is the idea of an economy that's a continuous auction. So everything is on auction all the time. And this paper it won the Nobel Prize in Economics. And in it, William Vickery compares the progressive auction to the Dutch auction and finds that the auction that achieves optimal resource allocation is a sealed bid second price auction. And it just skips all the formalities and procedures and jumps straight to the optimal result without manipulation. So inspired by mechanism design and conviction voting, we came up with merit signaling, which is a for loop. So for each project in the DAO, step one, the contributors to the project, they signal or stake their tokens towards the sub-projects according to the percent support or merit of that sub-project. Step two, every time incoming funds arrive at a project, it automatically gets distributed through smart contracts to the sub-projects according to the percent of the merit that they hold. And you apply this recursively to each sub-project and to each sub-sub-project, down to each task and subtask and each individual contributor. Okay, so finally back to that question of, well, what if two projects conflict? That is a question of ownership. Here's an XKCD comic describing the perils of patents. Remember when we prosecuted Microsoft for bundling a browser with an OS? Imagine the future we'd live in if we'd been willing to let one tech company amass that much power. Thank God we nipped that in the bud. So the meaning of this comic is explained in that website. But during the browser wars, Microsoft started bundling Internet Explorer with its OS. And the US government deemed this monopolistic and unsuccessfully attempted to prohibit it. But the comic is asking us to think about how this compares to the copyright and monopoly disputes of today, and what have they actually done for our rights and for innovation. And another issue that often arises regarding ownership is if two projects conflict. For example, build a house and build a highway, but there's only one plot of land. So that's a real house in China. It didn't last very long, though. So one solution is Harberger Taxes, which says that you own something if and only if you pay a tax on it. And it turns out to be a self-assessed tax based on the value that you think it is. And basically, it gives an incentive for people to make works open source. This applies to software licenses. This doesn't apply to land usage, though, because at some point you still need to make a decision on what to do with the one plot of land. Another idea is, well, define ownership as competence. So tokens are supporting the competence of teams building the products, not the ownership of the products. And the future of ideas is a Creative Commons book by Lawrence Lessig, the father of the Creative Commons, where basically we protect rights without detracting from innovation. So back to the question, what if two projects conflict? Well, to answer that, there is always a third choice. So we've got 1, house only, 2, highway only, 3, a house in a highway, or a highway in a house, or none of the above. So by the way, this is a picture of the Gate Tower in Japan. It is an office building with a highway going through it, and both work perfectly fine, and it's even a tourist attraction. All right, to summarize, today I covered decentralization and DAOs, including voting, funding, resource allocation, and ownership. And next is a long, long list because there are too many people to thank to fit here. So I want to thank everyone, the Bitcoin Training Conference, Opolis, Aragon Project, Giveth, Native, the Council for the Advancement of Blockchain Technology Use, Securities and Exchange Commission, Disclosure Exchange, various meetups of the Colorado blockchain, and you.